Hi, this is Stephanie Stock, the president of Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. Today we're interviewing Ethan Lindenberger. He's an 18-year-old who grew up in a non-vaccinating family and has now made the decision to vaccinate himself as an adult. Ethan's mom reached out to OAMF a couple of days ago about concerns about how the media was portraying their story. Ethan, I know you both have been inundated with media the last few days, and I appreciate you both agreeing to take the time to give us your story in an uncut version so that we can really let people know what you want to convey. Growing up with your mom, did she discuss with you the reasons why she didn't want to vaccinate you guys? And if so, what reasons did she give you?
So she kind of did in a way where it was like she would give us her reasons. She would say that vaccines cause autism, brain damage, that people she knew had been impacted. So, I mean, she did explain it in a sense, but there really wasn't any evidence presented. It was more an emotional appeal. And I didn't really understand it. It was just a thing that she said and that we were just kind of grown up to believe. So in a sense, we understood it and she would explain it, but not in a way, you know.
Okay, so it was more vague. It was just more of a vague reason. She didn't really get down
right.
into
Passingly, it'd be like, yeah, I don't vaccinate my kids because vaccines are bad. We would kind of nod and be like, okay.
Okay. What initially motivated you to look into why you might want to be vaccinated or look into the vaccine issue in general?
So what kind of motivated me to start looking into it was that, you know, that vague black and white kind of, I don't vaccinate my kids because vaccines are bad, really didn't represent the larger discussion. So I don't know, I'm trying to think of a way to explain this. Maybe it was just that online that people would debate with her, that people would just say, that's not accurate, that's not true, whenever she shared a video or an article. And so I just saw that maybe she wasn't entirely sharing the entire story, or that maybe there was another side to this I wasn't hearing. And that's when I kind of caught wind of the pro-vaccine movement. And just naturally more information started coming in, and I had to try and weed out the scientific sources and what was legitimate.
Okay, well that actually leads me to my next question, which was what kind of resources did you use to come to your decision? Like what kinds of—
I actually looked into a couple different sources in terms of like larger organizations such as the CDC, WHO. I looked at other sources that they kind of linked to and other scientific studies that they cited. You know, Pew Research Center was a great source that I used. So those were kind of the main ones that, you know, at school we were taught were really reliable. And those were kind of the foundation. And those, the thing is with CDC and with Pew Research Center especially too, they really expand a lot of their research, which is like they cite a article or a study that studied like 300,000 kids. And so it's not just like CDC says this, it's that CDC finds in a giant study that this is true, that also was based on this study. And there's a large network that kind of comes out from that. And so I look at sources like that, you know. Also historical evidence is a big part. So when you look at cases like polio, where the vaccine for polio was, you know, so effective that even the creators were awarded Nobel Prizes for medicine, I believe. And like, that's a huge deal. The fact that a polio vaccine won awards like, you know, a Nobel Prize, and it was the reason that polio was able to be largely eradicated, especially like with the United States specifically.
So those were the main things you were looking at.
Yeah.
Now, as fact as disease rates, did you look at all at the diseases themselves? Like the CDC Pink Book is a great reference point for looking up disease mortality, morbidity, the possible side effects of the disease. Did you look at those statistics at all when you were making your decision?
So did I look at like CDC statistics in terms of like
measles,
side effects for vaccines?
No, not for vaccines. The actual diseases. Like, did you look up the measles death rate?
Yeah. So that's a great question. You know, with measles, the average death rate was around 1 in 10,000, I think was the statistic I've largely seen been cited. But the thing is that people would point to is that when you look on like Wikipedia, they'll cite, you know, 1 in 10,000 upwards of, you know, 1 in 300,000. And a lot of numbers like that can be really vague, but it's hard to find a specific hardline number. And, you know, at the same time, when you're looking at sources like the ones my mom would present, she even shared a video with me from stopmandatoryvaccines.com. And they presented a statistic that was 1 in 10,000 was the death rate for measles. And there's been 447 plus deaths to the measles vaccine in the past 15 years. And so statistics like even that being presented are extremely different than just saying flat out there's more deaths in this regard than in this, because the way that that information can be skewed is really important. And so with that case specifically, with the stopmandatoryvaccines.com thing, they said, okay, 1 in 10,000 measles death on average, 447 measles vaccine deaths. Those are two very different ways that that number is presented, because one's a percentage, one's based off 1 in 10,000 number, based on the number 10,000. The other is just flat. And so those are two very different ways that data is being presented, which is explicitly meant to defend one side. And so you have that kind of skewed data, that almost like hardline propaganda in a way, that is contorting data, contorting information to defend a point even when it wouldn't be valid otherwise. And so it's really hard to find those numbers and look at them in a way, because there's so many different motivations. And so I've looked at stuff like, the measles death rate, when you look at the amount of cases of polio and how widespread that was, how, with right now we have more than 100 cases of measles. So I'm trying to look into as many numbers as I can, but I'm not a doctor. I can't cite every single source I've looked at, so
right.
I try my best.
Definitely. Now, the CDC Pink Book is an excellent resource, and it actually will give you the specific statistics. For measles, the death rate is 0.2%, and that's what's cited in the CDC Pink Book, so that's a great reference point. Now, speaking to the vaccine injury rate, when you are comparing measles death rate to vaccine injury rate, one of the issues with that is that, I don't know if you're familiar with David Kessler. He is the former FDA commissioner. He reported that about 1% of serious adverse reactions are actually ever reported. So if that is the case, then you look at the vaccine injury compensation program and you look at the $4 billion in payouts there. And approximately only 5% of those cases reported to VAERS actually get seen, and only about 30% of that 5% actually get compensated, and that's $4 billion. So the question there would be, if we don't even have actual statistics on the number of deaths that have occurred, because we only have maybe a 1% adverse event reporting rate, then how would we actually do that comparison? So in one aspect, I would agree with you that that's not a good comparison, but on the other side, I would say it's because we don't even have the appropriate numbers to use for that.
So the thing that I have when it comes to a small percentage of reporting, with a lot of really large issues, you're going to see that statistics have a big gap between what's the estimate and what the large amount is, based on a lack of reporting and a percentage, like a small percentage of people coming forward with those cases that can't be reported. I know when I was looking into, I lead a debate club at the high school, we were talking about gun control. And one thing that we even brought up was there was a number that I think it was CDC published about the amount of people that use their guns in self-defense or to stop a crime. And it was between like 500,000, like 3 million, because they just weren't sure how many people go unreported and what the real number is. And so with a lot of big numbers, you have a huge gap. And with something like that, where it's, okay, we only have this 1% of it being reported, or the 1%, like what, with the very small amount that we have, you still can look at statistics of like the amount of, like the percentage of likelihood that you're going to react badly to a vaccine. So I've seen percentages like 1 in 300,000 people have a seizure. And so, there's still a lot of different statistics you can see that point to a really low chance that you have a either bad reaction or even fatal. So that's what I would say, where even if there's not a lot of reported cases, we still have a general likelihood, which is still really low.
Ethan, I'm the mom of a vaccine injured child, and there are many children that have been injured. Many have been compensated. There are actual cases that have been compensated. What would you say to parents that have an injured child and they are looking to protect that child, and of course they're, genetically their siblings, possibly protecting their siblings from harm? Do you support a parent's right to protect a child that has been injured and their siblings from vaccination if that's their choice to make?
Right. So there are two things I want to address with that question. Just first, flat out, like, absolutely I do. Because you have already, where in all 50 states, you have medical exemption, which is totally legal. The only thing that people are kind of concerned with is that you can't religiously or personally exempt out of vaccines in about like 6 or 7 states, something around that number. And with the rest, that either one or both are still allowed. But in all 50 states, you are allowed to medically opt out of vaccines, at least for public schools and certain criteria like that. And, any doctor worth his salt would never sit down and go, every single person, regardless of circumstance, should be vaccinated. Because genetics play into a role of your allergic reactions, and because each vaccine is individually different depending on their composition and what they're vaccinating against, I would still say, do your own research. Don't write off all vaccines because one had a negative effect. Even though that totally makes sense, you could easily speak to your doctor, speak to your physician, and they could come up with the conclusion that, no, you should not be vaccinated. And in that case, herd immunity will protect you, because at least this is something that I've addressed as well. And with this question particularly, I'm totally in support of people not getting vaccinated if they can't, or if they really have a health reason not to. There was a person on Reddit who talked about how they have to take immune system depressors because their bones would fuse together, and they have like a medical, almost like medical disability to where their body cannot function with a high immune system function.
Yeah, they're immune suppressed. Mm-hmm.
Right. So immunodeficient or immune suppressed or immunocompromised, that kind of idea. People like that are totally not meant to be vaccinated and have to be protected by herd immunity. Where people like myself who are totally able to get vaccinated should be, because that way they don't transmit a disease to someone who isn't, that shouldn't be getting that vaccine. So someone like, and I wouldn't say your own daughter, like, obviously I don't want to use that as an example, but like for someone like that individual who, is immunodeficient or compromised, he's more susceptible and more at risk to contracting a disease that's preventable by vaccine, obviously. So everyone else doing so creates that herd immunity that protects that person.
Do you believe that a parent who has a child that has been vaccine injured, or even just a very negative reaction, do you believe that that parent should continue to vaccinate that child and their siblings who may also be susceptible in order to protect someone else's child that is immune deficient? Do you believe that a vaccine injured child or a sibling of a vaccine injured child is of potential less value than an immune compromised one? Because that is the situation we're currently facing.
Are they of less value? No, not at all. I mean, on a medical and, human level, and the thing for me is that genetics do play into effect. Allergies usually are typically paralleled in multiple siblings where they share an allergy, but sometimes they don't. For instance, at least for myself, I have a very harsh reaction to fish, and I'm allergic to fish, and some of my siblings aren't. And it just depends on that circumstance and what you inherit and what genes you inherit from your parents, from both your mother and father. Just because one individual has, a reaction doesn't mean all of them do. And again, I'd say that that's up to your doctor, and I would never claim to have a full understanding. And if you as a parent decide, I just say along with the advice from your doctor, that's the best route to pursue, I would never say that is, any less important or even, educated than someone who decides to vaccinate their kids.
Okay. So you believe that a parent could opt out, but basically only if their doctor was in agreement with it. You do not believe a parent should be able to opt out based on the fact that they've witnessed the injury and the damage and they don't want to take the chance with a different child. You believe that parent should take a chance with a different child in order to protect an immune deficient child that they do not know.
Well, I wouldn't say that they should take the chance necessarily. That kind of makes it sound like you're kind of rolling the dice with your kids.
Yeah, well, it is. It is.
Well, I would say, at the advice of your doctor, though, because they know that they're the ones that would be closest with your family, and especially like a family physician that deals, very closely with your kids and has experiences alongside you and has come along with you. Like, that would be at least an example where a doctor's advice should legitimately be taken into consideration. I wouldn't say legally that doctor's advice should be binding, that as long as your doctor doesn't write up and say like, hey, absolutely, you cannot do this. And you go, well, too bad. Like, that's totally a case where that I could see that at least being okay, but I'm not a politician. I would never speak towards specific legislation. And at the same time, when it comes to, again, a specific child that is vaccine injured, you can't treat that individual case as this is the case for everybody or even everyone in my family. You still have to try and consult a medical professional and see if your other children are able to protect that child that is injured and is immunocompromised or deficient from spreading a disease to them. And so, for instance, if say I have a child and they have a reaction, I go, okay, let's not vaccinate again. That's very tragic, and that's most likely a very low occurrence that is not meant to happen. If I have a different child who my doctor says is very different condition, very different circumstances in terms of their health and their body and their genes they inherited, that they are good to go with their vaccines, then I would say, okay, at their advice, I think that this probably is the best medical decision. And if I decide not to, maybe I should be able to make that decision. But again, I don't want to speak towards legislation.
Yeah. Now, the incident that you just mentioned is actually very interesting. One of my very, very close colleagues, she's an engineer in the medical field. She had a child that was severely injured by a vaccine, and she was assured that her daughter would be fine and to go ahead and proceed. And unfortunately, that daughter ended up having a massive seizure during her vaccination, and she ended up with a seizure disorder. So unfortunately, it took that mom 2 children to have to suffer through before she came to the conclusion that vaccines were no longer a good thing for her family. So unfortunately, with your theory of we should consult the doctor and hope for the best and go ahead and get vaccinated to protect the herd, unfortunately, there are many children that are being lost via that mentality. So that's why I believe it's extremely important that we retain exemption rights for reasons of conscience and religious reasons, because you can't know for sure until your child is damaged, and at that point you can't go back.
I would still interject though and say that at the same time, what you're kind of distinguishing again is that my claim is that you should speak to a doctor and then consult their advice and take it as biblical word. In no way or shape have I said that that's totally the case. And again, I would never speak towards legislation and say that those rights should be revoked from a parent. But at the time, that's a discussion that is taking place. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a politician. I'm not anyone that there's people that are way smarter than me that are spearheading that discussion. Because of that, though, the opinions I hold of, okay, doctors and medical professionals do know more than me, and they have trained and gone to schooling for their education. And I would like to take their advice at, as truth. I would still obviously do my own research, even as a pro-vaccine individual, in the same way that someone else would. And I still hold that evidence you're kind of providing, that, you do have a friend, which is tragic, and there are many people, in your own words, that's still not necessarily anecdotal evidence.
And so before I move on, I want to ask you or give you a scenario. Before I move on, I wanted to confirm with you then. So do you support philosophical and religious exemptions for vaccination, or do you only support medical?
I would not, give my own opinion in that, because I honestly don't have one, because that is a legal issue that I haven't looked into enough, and that there are people smarter than me that have that discussion all the time.
No, this is just a freedom issue. I'm just curious your personal opinion on freedom. Do you believe a mom should have a right to a religious or a philosophical exemption, or do you only believe a mom should have a right to a medical exemption?
With legislation and with voting, I take that very seriously, and I would totally, investigate, look at evidence, and educate myself on all the large legislation that is taking place within my state or country that I can. Everyone's a very busy person. Everyone has their own life, but, voting is obviously still very important. And with something like that, that's extremely important, because you're talking about potentially taking away rights or protecting people depending on which side you fall on. If I was to see that legislation take place, I would, again, educate myself further, look into the topics, look into your points of specific individuals that have suffered from injuries, specific families that have suffered multiple injuries for taking the advice of their doctor, looking at what data we have, and trying to find the best anecdotal evidence we can for the statistically best choice available, based on, what concrete evidence I can find. In discussions like the one, between my mom and I, or between individuals on both sides of that fence, are extremely important to finding that out, because once those legislative discussions take place, you really need to dig your heels in and find out where people stand and say, okay, well, I need to understand where my opinion lies, determine yours, and maybe we can compromise. Maybe we can learn something. Maybe we can even change our opinions. And, I haven't had those discussions necessarily yet, but I also haven't really seen that legislation take place. And even if that is right now or in the future, that would just push me to look into it and vote on it when that comes about.
Okay. Now, you mentioned anecdotal evidence, and you also mentioned concrete evidence. And I'd like to bring up a point, and it's something that that I've thought about many, many times. Before we had, science, before we had statistical data, we had people living on the farm, we had wells, etc. out there. And there was a time period where, people would go out and maybe they'd go to a certain water source, and they'd come back and those people would get sick. Now, right. I don't know how many people it would take, but eventually in a tribe or maybe maybe there was some people, Indian, American Native Indians living, and they came across a well, and they had or not a well, excuse me, but like a water source, and they found that they got poison from that. How many cases before they go back and say, we're not going to drink from that spring anymore or that river anymore because we have enough evidence to say, hey, this is a problem. So what I would ask the community of people who very much try to downplay vaccine risk-aware parents and their children that have been injured, we oftentimes ask, how many of us will it take before there is enough anecdotal evidence to say, we need to acknowledge these people? Have you considered that or thought about that before statistical data, before any of that stuff happened? We survived as a civilization. We're still here. We didn't go extinct. So we managed to do that by finding which berries were poisonous. And how did we do that? Because we saw some people drop dead from eating poisonous berries, right, in our tribe. Told other people, and that is how we have survived in humanity across the years.
Okay. I understand your question, and I before you go on further, there's a couple of points I need to address. I don't mean to cut you off.
That's okay.
Okay. So
I went off a tangent on wells, so go ahead.
Okay, so for your first presentation and points, I would kind of distinguish. There's a difference between your idea of personal and anecdotal evidence that we look at today versus when we were tribal. When we were tribal, there was no difference between personal and anecdotal evidence because those are one and the same, which I think was kind of your point, which was that when something happened, we took it because that was all we had. But you also have to look at the fact that we've been extremely misinformed in past conceptions and beliefs. We used to believe a bunch of crazy stuff as we progress as society, both in medicine and in everyday life. Mm-hmm. And so people thought that it was a great idea to not separate their well from their sewer water, and that obviously caused big risks, and then we had to change that, overhaul that. So I understand your point of okay, so we have evidence taking place of reactions versus, consequences and changing our approach. But the only issue I have with that also with the kind of berry argument is that you're talking about eating poisonous berries versus getting vaccines and how those are possibly comparable. But poisonous berries, you're talking about how consistently every single time you take those berries, you're going to die. And that proves through experience that those berries are poisonous. Now, today we look at that and we go, what is the chemical composition of this berry? What is inside of it? What elements are found in it that could be poisonous? So if we find, cyanide inside of a berry, we know that it's probably going to be poisonous to some degree. And then we look at that and go, that's why it's been poisonous. So we take those personal experiences, then we look at the data involved in the actual evidence scientifically, and we can make those, conclusive connections. Cyanide's been proven to be poisonous. These berries are poisonous. Makes sense. For vaccines, the problem is that you're talking about an allergic reaction or a reaction to the contents of the vaccines, which largely scientifically, as of right now, with the evidence we have, is very minor. And you have to draw parallels between why that's happening. And usually that's just brought up to genetics and, natural allergies to contents inside vaccines, which are even sometimes listed in the vaccine as this is something that could happen. And even you can find statistics like 1 in 300,000 chance you have a seizure. That is a risk that we understand and know of. But the thing is, when you're drawing those connections, that's a very different comparison than berries. Those vaccines largely are super beneficial, and a very minute number of times do people have very bad reactions and very substantial reactions, at least with the evidence we have. And so with the berries, it's extremely different, where that's consistently the case.
Well, I realize the berries isn't the best analogy, but my point was that I'm just questioning how many parents would need to come forth before we would take a consideration that maybe what they're saying needs to be investigated. To get the statistical data that you would like to have, we would need to actually compare the health outcomes of unvaccinated children to the health outcomes of the vaccinated. And that would be the only true way to come up with the numbers on what kind of injury rates we're getting. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I agree that comparing the health benefits of vaccines for unvaccinated kids and the consequences obviously involved between vaccine injury and also contracting preventable disease need to be compared, both on a statistical level and on a health level of how big the consequences are. So if you're seeing that only like 25 people die from a disease every week that is preventable, but 300 are dying every week from the vaccine, then that's a comparison that's very important that you need to distinguish, okay, maybe the vaccine's even more dangerous than the disease. The issue is, though, I have never seen, a specific statistic that's made that distinguishing, difference in terms of vaccine's danger.
Right. We don't have a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, so we aren't able to get that. I know the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge is looking to raise funds to do that study, but that has not been done yet. Did you question that at all when you were looking at the research? Did you ask, that's strange, I wonder why they don't have a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study? Did that cross your mind?
I suppose in a way, but you also have to consider that we have, again, real world circumstances of vaccines and their benefits. And you also have to see that the likelihood, the percentage effectiveness of vaccines I've seen floating anywhere between 85 to 95% between that area of preventing diseases. And so for me, I look at that and go, wow, that's a high percentage that you can have that defense against that effectiveness for the vaccine preventing a disease being spread. If you are vaccinated and you have to come in contact with that disease, that's a pretty substantial number.
Did you take a look at the length of time that the vaccine was considered efficacious for each of the vaccines? Did you take a look at that? Like how long immunity would last potentially?
Yeah, immunity does not last forever. You need to get revaccinated. I'm not sure if it's every couple of years or if it's, every 10 years. I don't know if it's I know it's not extremely long time. It's definitely not permanent, but that's also why you need to get revaccinated often for these vaccines. Often is a relative term.
Right. So if a person did need to get revaccinated often in order to keep the disease rates down, then technically they would be incurring the risk of vaccine injury every whatever years it took, say 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years. You'd be reincurring another risk each time you took a vaccine, correct?
Technically, but you also have to understand that each time you are taking that risk, which is a term that kind of implies that there is a substantial risk, which is, I would say, is a little inaccurate.
I'm just saying there is a risk every time you are vaccinated.
Well, here's how
the number of times you get vaccinated statistically will increase your likelihood of potentially having a reaction should you have one, correct?
Well, of course, but the only thing I would say in response to that is that when you're looking at statistical differences between your chance and risk between each vaccination, if the number we have right now is conclusive that it is extremely small percentage chance, anywhere to 2 to 3%, even then I wouldn't know if it's that high or low. I'm not sure. Let's say that number for hypothetical discussion, like 1 to 2 to 3%. Okay, so you do it multiple times, and does that risk enhance to, more than 4 or 5? It's still extremely low by standards compared to the effectiveness of the vaccine.
Okay, so let me really quick touch. So based on what you just said, you're saying anywhere from 1 to 3% is statistically very low as far as risk, correct?
No, not necessarily. No. What I'm saying is if we're talking about hypothetically like a percentage risk like that, which I would say personally is pretty high, is there a large difference between like 3 to 3.5 to 4 to 5? Like is 3 and 5 extremely different? Possibly depending on how many people are getting vaccinated. But again, I'm saying that chance increase of getting vaccinated again, if the risk is extremely low, is still much lower than the comparatively large effectiveness and extremely large effectiveness of vaccines that's potentially saving way more lives than it could even hypothetically be harming, which I would still question.
Okay, let's use the Mmr vaccine because that's the one that's really in controversy right now with the measles outbreak. Okay, so let's say a mom has a child that was injured or had a seizure or something more severe from the Mmr vaccine, okay? And let's say maybe that even if that risk is only, we have no idea, we're just throwing out a number. Let's say it's 3 or 4% for that mom, for the other child. We have no way of knowing that. We're just throwing out numbers. How do you feel contrasting that with the measles death rate, which is 0.2% according to the CDC? Would you ask a mom to risk a child's health over a 0.2% death rate from the natural disease, which would provide that child with immunity for the rest of his or her life? Would you think that was I mean, if you're looking at relative risk here, even if there was a 2% chance that child could be harmed, is that worth it to prevent an infection that's basically cold-like symptoms and a rash for 10 to 14 days with lifelong immunity and only a 0.2% death rate? And I think a lot of parents are looking at those kinds of statistics and saying, is the risk worth it for my child? Since we don't know numbers, we don't know the vaccine injury risk numbers because that data has not been presented to us. We don't have it. So how can we take the rights away of parents to make that decision? We do have the death rate for measles. So a parent should have the right to decide if the death rate for measles is more of a threat to them than a reaction or a potential death from the vaccine, especially if they have witnessed it in a family member or their own child or a friend. Would you disagree with that?
I'm trying to think how I can address that question. Here's what I would say to start is that the comparison that you're drawing that it is unanimously agreed that the MMR vaccine is more dangerous than the disease. I'm not saying that. I'm saying whatever the relative risk is for the vaccine, which we can't know because the data is not available to us. Okay. I'm just trying to clarify.
Yeah, no. I want to be clear too because I don't want to be misconstrued. I'm saying, do you believe a parent should have the right to accept the 0.2% risk of death from measles versus an unknown risk of death with a child they've already had an injury with? Because I would say, statistically speaking, the probability of that child having another injury is going to be a lot more than 0.2%. And does the mom have that right to make that decision? I mean, it keeps coming back to rights because we don't have the statistical data to be able to draw a firm conclusion. So I was just wondering how you would feel about that when you're comparing percentages.
Okay, so with the MMR vaccine specifically, here's kind of what I've said in the past to different people, which is that I have heard that, the MMR vaccine is, from some people, as they hold the opinion, is largely unnecessary because the fact that you don't necessarily need to vaccinate against it, and if you catch the disease, you can just develop immunity. I mean, the issue I have with that is that, if the data proves, which I'm saying, not that it does, but if the data proves that vaccines, in terms of the MMR vaccine, are more safe than the death rate of the disease, well, then obviously we should vaccinate against it because you're saving lives on a percentage level. If it's more dangerous and the side effects of the disease are largely kind of bearable, and they usually almost entirely don't lead to death, well, then I'd say, of course, and that's something that a parent should hold to their, own decision. In terms of impact of that disease specifically, maybe, and again, I'm not sure on legislation. And this is just purely on kind of the hypothetical. The only issue I have on top of that, is that with the measles vaccine, with the MMR vaccine, you're talking about how, okay, so it's not that bad. We don't really need to vaccinate it. It'll be fine. With the fact that measles has come back in 10 different states with more than 100 reported cases, and depending on who you're looking at, that could either be a huge number or, nothing important. People have been connecting dots and saying that there is a attributing factor between that number and, anti-vax children or families, or, the movement of anti-vaccine individuals. And if that is true, you're talking about how preventable disease is spreading because people are choosing not to vaccinate against it. And if measles was replaced with something more dangerous, and I go back to this example because it's the most scary one, like polio, does that change the circumstances? And I think so, in terms of like the importance of vaccination in general. That vaccinations are important on a general level, not just all of them specifically. So I kind of hope that makes sense, where it's like, maybe measles isn't that big of a deal. Maybe the MMR vaccine is more dangerous. I wouldn't be able to say conclusively. But even if it is, we can still see how the current situations and past are proving, or maybe are proving, that vaccines are still important to prevent those diseases in general. And that could show conclusively, eventually, that other diseases should be vaccinated against to keep them from coming back. So
okay, no, that I understand what you're saying. I'd like to say, since we don't have that data on the MMR, I would hope that you would support, until the point that you felt, okay, there is enough data to show a difference, that you would support a parent's right to make that decision regarding the statistic.
Well, and it is currently for almost the entire country, except for a few states, which is still kind of obviously a big deal to consider. For almost 43 to, more or less states, you're talking about how they either have one or both religious and personal exemption. And so you're talking about how a substantial amount of the country still holds that as important. But as people start to look at more data, that question still arises, is it important to reevaluate the way we look at that? Which I think is, a good discussion that can take place as we get more data. I'm not saying that there's an answer yet, but, it's something that should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, there definitely is a move toward removing exemption rates. And every time the media brings up the measles outbreak, that is usually where the conversation goes. Going back to what you said before, though, because we were talking about measles death rate, you said your main concern would be, okay, maybe even if we did find measles, the vaccine, maybe if it did cause more injuries or whatever, compared with the disease, we have to worry about things like polio and stuff like that. Are you aware of the CDC pink books? Are you aware of the death rate for well, I shouldn't say that, I guess we call it the death rate because it means you are paralyzed. Your lungs are basically paralyzed. So unless you're on a ventilator, you're dead. So do you realize that it's a 0.02% rate for bulbar polio, which is the type of polio that would paralyze your lungs or quote unquote kill you? 0.02%. Were you aware of that statistic from the CDC on polio?
In what regard is that statistic? I'm not sure.
If you go to the CDC Pink Book and you look up the disease polio, the death rate for polio, which would be meaning you have no control over your breathing, which would be a ventilator, is 0.02%. Were you aware that the statistic for death for polio was that low? And also that it's a less than 1% chance of permanent paralysis, according to the CDC. Were you aware of those two statistics?
Not necessarily, but at the same time, we're talking about statistics in terms of the death rate of polio, we're talking about how historically we had a extremely dangerous situation with polio. I think back in the 50s is when it was discovered, where polio was causing paralysis in large numbers from what I have recalled looking into. Correct. And so, even if the death rate is low, I don't know if that's statistics regarding current situations, which could even be attributed to the vaccine. But I have to look at
this is the death rate.
How that number.
This is the death rate of polio. This has been the statistic since CDC, had the Pink Book out. Okay. This has been the statistic. So you're less than 1% of polio cases will end in permanent paralysis. Less than 1% in permanent paralysis. 0.02% death rate, and about 95+% of the cases, well, actually it's 75% are asymptomatic, which means you can have polio and have zero symptoms, and then somewhere between 11 to 15%, whatever the difference is between the less than 1%, that is actually people that have cold-like symptoms and maybe a stiff neck. Mm-hmm. So those are coming out straight out of the CDC Pink Book. That is the data that we have on polio. So I would go so far as to say, unless you have an outbreak across the entire United States, which potentially you could, and you could be looking at maybe a couple of 100,000 people that would end up paralyzed over the entire United States. The chance of that is pretty slim. You do know that polio is transferred through fecal contact, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so my question would be, if the big fear is even polio, a lot of people are not even looking at the paralysis rate or the death rate with that. So that's a little bit concerning to me. You seemed a little surprised when I gave you those statistics.
No, I'm just confused in terms. I'm just confused with the way you presented that data in terms of what that was, regarding.
Well,
if we're talking
vaccine choice here, because you said, well, maybe if the Mmr vaccine. Maybe the risk of injury compared with, how low of an incidence of, measles death, because it's 0.2%. Well, technically that's a higher death rate than polio, but it's still a relatively mild illness. So everybody's afraid of polio, but the death rate's less than measles. So I'm a little bit perplexed. I thought you might have a thought on that.
Well, it's not necessarily that you kind of, guess caught me off guard. I'm just still trying to work through how you were wording that and, what you were kind of attributing that data to. If we're talking about the specific death rate of polio, we're talking about its comparison to current day, diseases like measles and stuff like that. The only thing I would still say is that when you're talking about specific individuals that are immunocompromised, deficient, or children that are very young, they are more susceptible to have adverse reactions that could be more threatening to them because of their either weaker immune system because of their bodies. And so I try and take that into consideration as well, is that with something like, for instance, whooping cough. For whooping cough, it's as far as I understand, a generally mild disease that doesn't have very, large implications. The death rate from whooping cough, as far as I'm concerned, extremely low. The idea behind that, though, is that whooping cough can easily be transmitted, as far as I understand, and that for someone that's younger or immunocompromised that is, a little more susceptible to very adverse effects from any disease, that you're preventing that person from possibly being put in harm's way. So that's the only thing that I would say regarding even statistics with low death rates, is that you don't want to transmit to them with someone that's in a weaker state,
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. It'll again come back to whether or not a parent is willing to put an immune compromised child that they don't know over the health of their own child, which is the major controversy.
Which again is coming back to the statistics, though, of the dangers of vaccines, which we haven't really been able to compromise with. So I think we kind of find ourselves back at the same impasse.
Yeah, we need more data. I think we both agree on that. We don't have statistical data on vaccine injuries and that the comparison there. But I would like to wrap back around to another question. And that was, how do you feel when you looked at the package? I'm sure you looked at package inserts when you were making your decision. Section 13.1 in the majority of the vaccine inserts states that vaccines have never been tested for or never evaluated for carcinogenic, mutagenic, or effects on fertility. How did you feel about that, knowing that there's no science on carcinogenic or mutagenic or fertility effects when the children between the age of 1 and 15 in the United States, the second to the fourth leading cause of death is cancer, and about 4 million children are vaccinated a year, and with a product that's never been tested for carcinogenic effect? Does that concern you, or was that one of the things that maybe concerned your mom?
I mean, I definitely think that she's brought that up before, and we talked about that. And one of the things that we've talked about is that because of that experimentation that's so necessary, and because of the statistical research that still needs to be done, that there is a risk imposed, which I can understand. But at the same time, because that hasn't been experimented or studied or anything like that, the statistics between, how much of an impact that has had, and if there are negative or no effects because of that, I still have to question if that leads to anything conclusive. Does that mean that vaccines are bad and that they conclusively cause extremely bad effects in terms of a mutagen level or a carcinogen level? I'm not extremely positive. And of course, we need more data to conclude that. But it comes back to, do we have to evaluate it based on the evidence we don't have, or do? And I would say we do. And because we don't have some evidence, we need to continue looking into that.
So you would say that you believe that the government or the CDC should do research on carcinogenic, mutagenic, and effects on fertility for vaccines. You agree that research needs to be done?
Right, absolutely. In any regard, I mean, research needs to be done in any scientific field conclusively, and continuing to replicate studies that have been largely accepted. And so no matter what study we're looking at, I almost always say absolutely continue to look into it. I'm extremely skeptical of almost any.
Continue to look into it because they've never looked into it, but you're suggesting.
Well, no, I'm talking about, I'm not even saying look into evidence we don't have. I'm talking about, I would even go as far as say look at evidence we do have. That's how far I would even say, my skepticism would rise when anyone would present any data. So your question pertaining to, okay, well, should we look into more of these carcinogen, mutagen, and these kind of open gaps we have in our research? Well, absolutely. But again, the reason I say yes is that because that still doesn't conclude anything, that doesn't lead to any concrete evidence, at least from what I've seen. And that goes back to what evidence do we have? And yes, we can all agree that more research should be done, but that doesn't lead to any.
You don't believe that research like that should have been done before we vaccinate 4 million children a year?
Well, what I'm saying is that I still think that there's a substantial amount of evidence in terms of our historical and scientific data that proves that vaccines are beneficial and least effective. And if we're talking about how there's some gaps in that, in terms of the specific questions in that regard, does that mean that effectiveness is demerited? I don't think so. And does that mean that the risk is still any higher or lower? I'm not sure. And just because there's some skepticism, does that mean that we should just throw away with vaccines? Not necessarily, but is there a discussion there? Absolutely.
I'm not suggesting we throw away vaccines. I'm suggesting we maintain choice because we have insufficient data on very important things, like whether or not 4 million children a year are vaccinated with a product that could be carcinogenic.
When I think, again, we come back to the same legislative discussion, and I've said before, I don't have an opinion or topic on that because there's people much smarter than me that have a legislative opinion. And right now we have a majority of people that can make that decision. So I still struggle to understand your question.
Okay, I guess my question, maybe you've answered it. You agree that yes, we definitely need to do research on whether or not vaccines could be contributing to cancer, mutagenic effects, or effects on fertility. I'm just asking if you think we should have done that before we vaccinated 4 million children a year for the last several decades, possibly. I mean, scientifically speaking, would you say it would be scientifically best to have tested a biological product for carcinogenic, mutagenic effects and effects on fertility before you vaccinate 4 million children a year for multiple decades?
So to answer your question, yes, but in hindsight, and here's the thing with that as well, is that my whole point is that absolutely research should be done and should have been done, or maybe for whatever reason the CDC has not concluded that evidence, maybe they haven't been able to find causation in the research. I don't know. I'm not the CDC. I don't know. So when we talk about that kind of, data, we have to continue saying, like, we need more data, we need more research, fund research that's doing that, that's independent and isn't sourced by pharmaceutical companies or the government. Obviously independent scientific studies are important, that are peer reviewed. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of thing is important, but should we just not vaccinate our kids because we don't have the information? I don't know if that's the answer.
Oh, well, that wasn't what I was suggesting at all.
I think is the implication of saying, should we have done that before we vaccinated kids?
Oh, I think scientifically speaking, that would have been the best choice. Yes. I think scientifically speaking, we should make sure a product is safe as humanly possible before we start vaccinating 4 million children a year with it.
Right.
And
I agree.
I guess we do agree on that point.
That obviously we should make it as safe as possible. But I think where we kind of maybe disagree is that our pieces of evidence or research that we have done conclude differently, that they are safe or they aren't. And possibly that, obviously legislation is important, and that's a whole different kind of topic.
Okay. When you were looking into vaccine research, how did you feel about the fact that with vaccine studies, they typically don't use an inert material for the placebo, that they typically use, say, an aluminum adjuvant, or they use another vaccine to compare to? How did you feel about that, scientifically speaking? Did you have concerns with lack of an inert placebo with vaccines?
Right. So the way the placebo effect is scientifically concluded is by giving someone an administrated medicine that has no effect, and seeing the comparison between the results of that evidence, that result, and comparing it to what was legitimately being tested. So if an aluminum-based vaccine was used, or any vaccine was used against another vaccine, the thing that I would come into the conclusion of, if it was listed as placebo and described as placebo, is that the scientists involved were most likely, and I'm not saying this is true, using that aluminum-based vaccine that had no effect compared to a vaccine that did. And, I could be totally wrong on that front, but judging from the fact that it's simply a vaccine with aluminum inside of it, does that mean that it has an effect? Possibly, but most likely not. So when we're talking about, do you just inject water into someone and also inject a vaccine? Like, what's the comparison there? I think there's a lot more, nuances to that specific argument. And I'd have to do a lot more research to kind of conclusively say, like, this is why that they use aluminum, this is why they don't, or this is why we should use a different substance to find a placebo, effect and difference.
Okay. Well, I mean, I actually have the answer to that question, but I can give you something to look into for later, because I know you're probably always wanting to look into research on this. Mm-hmm. A 2014 article in the journal Vaccine, they had a World Health Organization panel that was discussing in that, and they said that the gold standard for safety in any kind of a study would be a double-blind placebo study with an inert substance. Okay, meaning. Right. Like a sugar pill or saline, something like that. They also went on into detail in that journal, stating that with vaccines, they felt it was an ethical issue to withhold a life-saving product from a child, which was the reason why they did not use an inert placebo in the study. And in fact, they had listed several criteria that had to be met in order for you to even be able to use an inert substance in a vaccine trial, which I thought was kind of disturbing. It's like, here's the gold standard, we don't use it, and here's why. So I think that's something that you might want to definitely look into. And also, I'd like to state for the record, there are hundreds of thousands of parents in the United States who do not vaccinate their children, and we would be happy to take our child in and get them a sugar pill every time they wanted to test a new vaccine on a child and be a true placebo group, which is one of the things that I mentioned, the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge. You might want to look into them. They are working on wanting to do that research so that we can have that. We will have a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. We can have true placebos because we have a population of people that are unvaccinated and are willing to be part of any study that would benefit science in that way, since we've already made that life choice. I wondered, how do you feel about that? I mean, I'm assuming that you would be promoting of something like that. Yes, we've already got these kinds of individuals available. Let's utilize them so we can have true placebos in science for vaccine safety.
Right. And so if I'm understanding your question correctly, like, you know, we're talking about how there's a bias or incorrect way that we've been able to establish our placebo effect studies in vaccines, and that possibly more research needs to be done, and people are willing to do that. And should we allow them? I mean, absolutely. If people want to continue doing research and compare that. And here's the thing for me, is that if we support doing a new placebo trial and that's compared and we find a different study and we replicate that and we find it again, that's new substantial evidence. And I would never deny that. So of course that should be looked into, but does that mean that the original reasoning by the health panel was incorrect? I have to really look into their reasoning more elaborately. But I would still, that wouldn't change my opinion on the further studies that need to be done, especially by people like yourself that would be more skeptical of that reasoning given. You know, of course that you should be able to take part in that and get that sugar pill and compare those notes and have that study replicated. I would have no problem with that at all.
Yeah. Okay. So I can send you the link to that if you want to look into that further, because it was definitely an interesting read for me. I was pretty surprised when I read that.
Okay.
So the last thing I wanted to address, and I think that's basically why your mom reached out to me. She felt that the media wasn't portraying your story the way it was being cut. So I would like to ask you if there was things that were left out that you wanted to say, or how you felt about, how the media has portrayed your story with your mom thus far. Do you think they've been fair with you, or do you feel like there's been bias there? What are your thoughts on that?
So here's the deal from what I've seen in terms of these interviews and stuff we've been doing. We've been talking to people like MSNBC, NBC, CNN, Fox News, and the sorts. Do I believe that that's the highest level of scientific and journalistic integrity? No. I wouldn't claim that those are sources that I would ever even look into myself for scientific research. You know, if Fox News published an article that was like, measles outbreak is ravaging the country, I probably wouldn't even look at it. Like, that's just my thing, is that when it comes to scientific studies, you have to look at extremely particular sources, weed out what is extremely biased, and news is entirely biased. And if she's expecting a very scientific presentation of the issue that represents both sides of the debate without bias, then I would say she's even setting herself up for disappointment, because I would never even expect the media to entirely represent us correctly. And I don't know if they have or haven't personally, but I've just been trying to share my story as accurately as I can, and, you know, choose my words carefully so they don't contort those statements and those words. For the large part, I think I've done that well, in terms of being very cautious with how I word things, how I choose my statements, and how I approach discussion, you know, because that minimizes how much you can be contorted, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, as someone as my mom, we even did our discussion with Good Morning America, and we filmed for probably close to an hour and a half, where there was just back and forth, you know, questions and answers, and her answers extended to extremely long, you know, elaborate responses, which were great. And I'm proud that she has those, you know, elaborate thoughts, but simply television doesn't have time for, you know, a 15-minute rant on why, you know, there's other avenues for research. And so you might get lost in translation there. And so the thing for me is that there's an element of understanding how the media functions that, you know, someone like my mom may not have understood and been, you know, disappointed by, which I don't think is fair at all. And I don't know, when it comes to the scientific integrity of the story, and I guess the journalistic integrity more accurately, the journalistic integrity has been very particular to each source. So, I mean, I did my interview with the Washington Post, and it took like 3 minutes for that phone interview or that Skype call. Mm-hmm. So, like, nothing really there was misrepresented. And again, with Good Morning America, it talked for an hour and a half. They showed like 2 minutes of it. So of course, like, you could totally say they misrepresented us, because that's really not what the representation was accurate to. So it depends on how you view it. They haven't been cutting out my words and cutting out my mom, as far as I've seen, and changing it to say, like, instead of vaccines are bad to vaccines are good, and changing the entire, way that we presented those arguments. It's just been a little different in presentation, which is probably for viewership.
Right. Yeah, well, they do have to cut things down to very small amounts. I've been doing some interviews lately too, and they do have to cut a lot of that out. But I just was wondering on a personal level if you felt that, things were represented well. I'm sure it seems like you and your mom have a pretty good relationship, and I'm sure that you respect each other. And I haven't spoken to her yet, but I'm sure that even though she disagrees with you, she's respecting that you are an individual and that you are making a medical decision for yourself. And at OAMF, we concur. We believe that you're 18 years old and you've looked into this and you've made a decision, and we will support anyone's decision to whether they or not they want to vaccinate themselves or their children. We will always support that. And I thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. Not a problem at all.
All right. Have a great night.
Yep, you too.
Hi, this is Stephanie Stock, the president of Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. We are honored today to be interviewing Jill Wheeler. She is a non-vaccinating Ohio mom who recently had her 18-year-old son come forward and make the decision that he wanted to get vaccinated as an adult. She recently reached out to us with some concerns about how the media is portraying the story. And so we wanted to kind of get her perspective on what was going on. I know you've been completely inundated. This week has been an absolute, insane for you and your son both. So I appreciate you taking the time to, give us your story too. I know that you had stated you had 2 older children and you were starting to vaccinate them. And then I guess you had some concerns about the chickenpox vaccine, and that's kind of drove you to maybe investigate vaccines a little bit more, or to critique them a little bit. Do you want to maybe tell people what kinds of things you came across that made you say, hey, I think I definitely want to stop vaccinating?
Well, my firstborn, I was only 20, and so I didn't really know much about it. I just thought it was something you just did. When I had my second son, about 3 years later, I took him in for his vaccines, and I can't remember how old he was. He was fairly young when they gave him his chickenpox vaccine, and they said that he'd have to come back in 10 years to get it done again. And I'm like, I thought that the vaccines were, they were forever. You didn't have to do that. And they were like, no, you have to do it every 10 years. I'm like, for the rest of his life? Yes. And it kind of shocked me because I had chickenpox. All my sisters had chickenpox. Everyone I knew had chickenpox. And it wasn't we were miserable for 5 days, but we got over it. And I'd also heard that getting chickenpox as an adult is very dangerous, that it's better to get it as a child. So I was like, well, then why don't I just let him get the chickenpox? So he's going to be sick for 5 days. That doesn't make sense. Well, they're like, no, as long as you come back every 10 years, he'll never get it. And of course I'd already done it. And I went home and I was like, something's not right, because I was always under the assumption that these vaccinations were a forever thing. You get them once, you do the whole regiment series and you're good to go. So I went home and I started reading, and that was the biggest thing for me, was that I wanted answers. It wasn't that I was, against vaccinations or wanting to, show that the vaccinations were bad. I just didn't understand. I wanted to educate myself. So that's when I started digging and I started reading, and I got books. I actually, kind of ironic, I bought books that were completely for immunizations. I got books that were completely against immunizations. And then I got books that were kind of in the neutral. And I read, I asked around, I read some more, I researched. And the more I read, there was more things that started to come to light that I had no idea about. And again, I thought it was just something you did. And as I was researching, I realized that I had a choice. Well, as a young mother, I didn't even know that was an option. Again, I just thought it's something you had to do. And that kind of shocked me, that no one told me that I had the option to not vaccinate.
Right.
So I started reading, and the more in depth I got to immunizations, to vaccinations, what they were, what were in them, how people were affected by them, and how children were getting hurt, I was shocked. I was shocked. And after reading everything that I did read, I decided that it was absolutely not in my children's best interest to get immunized, to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I know Ethan had stated, because I asked him, I know your mom had looked into it, and did she kind of give you any details onto why she decided not to vaccinate you? And I know he felt that it was sort of emotionally driven. He didn't feel maybe that the facts were brought to him. So I was just curious if you had ever showed him any of the materials, like specific, like I'm interested in maybe what books you looked at, and you know, I know yet I'm a mom too, and I get it. Sometimes your kids come to you and you're like, because I said, right? You're just like, I do
Right.
this, I that, and you give a kind of a bridged version. We sort of forget that as our children are growing up, they're like developing their own personalities. They're getting, they're wanting to learn their own things. They're wanting to be their own people, especially boys. I've got boys too.
Right.
And it's easy to not get specific sometimes, and maybe it's to our detriment later. I think probably at this point you're maybe wishing, geez, I maybe I should have actually showed him the book or had him read the book or something like that, because you get to that point, you're like,
Right.
oh, I wish he knew more before all of this kind of exploded with the media. But
Right.
if you had it to do differently now, what books would you maybe have recommended to him, or what websites would you maybe have recommended that helped you, that might have made a difference for him?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, what's
That's
your
a hard question because, again, he's 18 years old, and I looked into it, 22 years ago. All the things that I read and researched were such a long time ago. But yeah, you're right. That's one thing that, he had, I guess, a couple years ago, he started asking me questions about it. And he's like, hey, mom, like, why don't you immunize? Why don't you give us our vaccinations? And I'm like, because they're terrible, because they could get you sick. There's bad side effects, and it's not worth the risk to me. You know what? If you get chickenpox, then we'll deal with it. You'll be sick for 5 days. You've gotten the flu before and you've been sick, so you'll be fine. No, you're good. Look how healthy you are. And they are. I've got 7 very healthy children. And I guess the knowledge was here in my head. And I just kind of assumed that he would see that I knew what I was talking about and just be, oh, okay. And
Right.
like I said, I have great kids. I really do. They're not rebellious at all. They're such sweet kids, good Christian children too. I mean, they're very involved in church. And I guess just we have a great relationship. We've always had a great relationship with all of my kids. So that was a fault on me to not really sit down with all my kids and say, look, I've made this decision and this is why. And I want you to know what I have found, what I've researched, what I've come across, why I made the decision that I did. I want you to know about it. And I think it was hard too. I think another thing that kind of caught me off guard is that my oldest, 26, she is very health conscious, and she is 100% against immunizations as well. So I didn't really have to explain anything to her. She just got it. She did her own research and she got it. Same with my 22-year-old. He just gets it. He is into that kind of stuff. He understands it without me having to explain it. So I think that I assumed that just kind of would follow. And I took for granted that they are all different. They're not going to all see it the way I see it. And I think with 2 already following in my footsteps, believing, researching on their own and saying, wow, mom, you were right. Yeah, it's not good. And seeing that with my older 2, to see him completely turn against what I believed, it was a shock. But again, he came to me many times and I just kind of sloughed it off because it was just a given for me that he wouldn't do it, because he would understand, hey, look, your sisters, your brother, they understand it. I'm your mother. I know you trust me. You love me. You have, listened to me in the past. It's not good. And I think that's whenever he started researching it himself and talking to other people. And of course, the people that he talked to were 100% pro-vaccine. I mean, they were absolutely for the vaccinations. And a lot of them were like, you've never been vaccinated? You need to go vaccinated, And I had no idea these conversations were even going on with people outside of our family that he was talking to. And again, that was a fault of mine. And I am definitely, open to realizing that. And if anything, and this is what I told Ethan, I'm like, even though I disagree with your decision that you've made, and I wish so bad that you wouldn't have made this, and I wish that you would have researched it more than what you did and talk to people that have had reactions, children that have had reactions to the vaccine. I said, at least you've opened my eyes to one thing, is that you have got, we've got Noah, Emma, Gabriel, Briar. We got 4 little ones that are coming up, and one day they're going to be in his position and saying, I am allowed to make this decision. So if anything, as much as I hate that it took this to get there, it opened my eyes to say, I can't take for granted that everything in here is just going to be assumed good with my kids or assumed right with my kids. They're their own person, and they're going to seek out those answers. And I have to go to them and say, this is why I've made the decisions that I've made for you. I want you to read what I know, read both sides. And that's another thing. I don't want to be like, this is why you don't, vaccinate. This is it. Look at this. I want to say, this is why they say you should. Let's look at everything. Let's lay everything out, dissect it, talk about it, talk to people. You ask me questions. I ask you questions. So like I said, I've taken away a lot of learning from this. It's been hard. It's hard even now. I know that he's going for his second rounds on the 25th. And of course I'm scared to death. I'm just like, oh my goodness. It's very scary, but
yeah.
And I can't stop him.
No, he's 18 now and he has to make his own decisions. I know when I was talking to him, I had brought up some things that he had not heard before that he was unfamiliar with, and it took him back a little bit. And I think that's the issue with this controversy, is both sides are not represented appropriately. The media shows a 100% bias towards vaccination. This is a fact. You've seen this play out in what's happened to you. It's happened to me in interviews I've done. It's happened to people across the country who have tried to do interviews, and it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And I mean, I know that when we were texting the other day, I mentioned that, I felt like this is an issue where here's a young man coming into his own, wanting to make his own decisions. And you have this issue, which the pharmaceutical industry is waiting to jump on. Absolutely. Right. This is a absolute gold mine situation for them to exploit. So they're jumping. He's got doctors commending him. He has got health agencies commending him. This is a time in a young man's life where, you want that reinforcement. You want to know, I'm smart. I'm making good decisions. This feels really good. And it's easy at that age to be taken by all of that. I could do it myself. I could see it happening to my kids. Anybody could. So it's really, I really am very disgusted with the media, the way they're using him to promote a political agenda. And I'm sure you're seeing that play out, this is all coming down to, oh, well, maybe we should lower the rate of consent. Maybe we should take away parents' rights to vaccine exemptions. And this is how they're using him, unfortunately. I mean, if that's how you feel, I'm assuming as well. I mean, you're watching this too. It's a cooing of the brains of, quote unquote, non-vaccinating moms. They're just moms. We're just moms who love our children more than anyone else on the planet. And we will fight to protect them. And we will research to the ends of the earth for them. And we will do our best to do what is right for them. And I know that's what you've decided to do too. But I do agree with you that it is very important as a non-vaccinating parent, or a vaccinating parent really, is to give the child both sides, equal sides. Right. That child make that decision on their own. So I think that's a really good takeaway for any parent who has watched this whole situation play out. Now, I'm curious, I know you did do a public school with the kids for a good portion of time. How did you find out that you had the right to be exempt for school?
How did I find out what now?
I was just
sorry, you broke up.
That's okay. I was just wondering, how did you find out that you had the right to opt out for vaccinations for school? Because a lot of people don't realize they have that right.
Right. I had a friend of mine tell me, we were going through this and someone said, you can't go to public school if they're not vaccinated. And I was talking to one of my friends and they were like, yeah, you can. I was like, they can? Yeah, you have to go to there and there's a consent that you have to sign saying it's against your religious or personal beliefs. And I was like, oh, well, that's great. And I remember the first time I went to one of the local schools here before we moved to Norwalk. It wasn't here in Norwalk, that we went to one of the sign-ups for kindergarten, and I went up and said, I don't vaccinate. And they're like, well, you can't have your health here. And I said, yes, I can. And they're like, no, you can't. And I was like, yes, I can. And I handed her the paper. Boy, she snatched that. It was the nurse, snatched that out of my hand so fast. And she did not like the fact that I knew what I was talking about at all. So she was not happy with the fact that I was aware of my rights and that I was sending a child to that school, you know, not being vaccinated. But I'm not the only mom out there. There's a lot of us. So
Yeah,
I know I'm not alone.
You're not alone. I looked at the CDC statistics, and it is 2.3%, sorry, 2.3% of Ohio students right are using exemption rights for philosophical or reasons of conscience or religious beliefs. We have a total of 2.6 using everything, so only 0.3 on medical exemptions. Right. But you know, we are a really small percent. You know, and for them to be coming after us like a witch hunt over 2.3% of exemptions, when you know, I mean, right. we know we don't have. They talk about herd immunity and we need 95% coverage in the community. Well, the community isn't just elementary school students. The community is everyone. And scientists have flat out said, you know, it wanes with time. So we know we have maybe 5 to 20 years of immunity with the Mmr vaccine, for instance, which is the big hoopla right now. So we have varying different ages of people that are completely not immune. We've never had 95% coverage.
No.
So why are we witch hunting these parents over 2.3% exemption rate? Because they're trying to protect their child from further harm. The whole thing is absolutely ridiculous.
Right.
So there's an agenda here, and you know that's they're going to promote it to the end because you know they have a product that needs to continue to be sold and trusted.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, 2.3% might not sound a lot to, you know, the number, but 2.3%, if you could get all of those to start being forced to vaccinate, what is that? It's more money for them. I mean, right. Let's call it what it is.
Monetarily speaking, the percentage is astronomical, but right. The percentages of quote unquote herd immunity playing right. out in the community, that's a whole different ball game. So that really is what gets me. I keep bringing that up with the interviewers, and that always is cut. First thing cut, right? We don't want to talk about that. Speaking of the media, is there anything that you felt was portrayed out of context, that, you know, things that they have cut specifically that you were like, I really wanted to get this out, and I didn't feel like that message was conveyed? Maybe you could convey that now.
Pretty much everything I said almost was cut. I mean, it was, you know, I mean, I'm watching it, and my favorite one was whenever, you know, they're doing their little clips in between things, and then he'll say something, and then I'll say like a one-liner, and then at the end they have me looking at him saying, you know, but he's a good boy and I'm proud of him for making his own decision. I'm like, well, that makes me look completely, you know, stupid. Like I'm walking into this interview going, oh no, I'm proud of you, good for making your own decision. What about the 20 minutes where I said, look, I am against vaccinations. I think what he's doing is wrong. I love him. I love him dearly, but he has not done the research that I feel he should have done. He has not looked at it like he should have. I think he made a rash decision. I think that part of that was my fault for not educating him. None of that was said. And then I love how it's followed up, you know, immediately by the whole mainstream media giving all these numbers about how important it is to vaccinate. And it was never anything for non-vaccinations, no numbers at all for it was all pushing you need to vaccinate. And it's like, oh my God. And I kind of knew that was going to happen, but I was going to take my chances on hoping that maybe something small would sliver its way in there to kind of, you know, hit home with why I didn't vaccinate. Didn't work. But
yeah, we're a little short on sunshine and lollipops on our side. That's for darn sure.
Yeah.
Now, I know there's been a lot of backlash, even from the non-vaccinating community, like all over Facebook. Are these paid actors? Is he getting money for doing these interviews? Trying to think of some. I mean, you could probably speak to some of this. Do you have any commentary for people on this issue of all of these, you know, personal attacks? Do you have anything you'd like to clarify on that?
Well, I think one thing that was kind of funny to me is, in fact, I just got one this morning from someone, you know, saying you've never posted anything, you know, that was anti-vax. And I'm like, what? I mean, you're going through which I have, which is kind of funny, but you know, I'm like, you guys are unbelievable. This is crazy. I have 7 children, 5 of which have never been vaccinated. That should speak volumes. So right there, I mean, what did I do? Plan this out for the last, you know, 22 years? This was my evil plan to get I was like, come on. It's just amazing. And yeah, I've been very much attacked by several anti-vaxxers that say that I'm not real. And, I really don't worry about it. We didn't ask for this. Ethan didn't ask for this. It came at a really strange time. I think there's so much in the media going on with the whole vaccination movement right now with everything. And, you can't explain some things. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I put on one post, I might have hired the 7 little ones to to portray my children. I'm like, golly, this is just unbelievable. You got to kind of laugh at it, and you're not going to be able to convince everyone that, that you're real or that your story is real. And that's okay. What I know is I don't believe in vaccinating kids. I studied. I do not think that it is the best thing for my children, and I won't do it. So if they choose to believe that I'm real, not real, you know what? I've got 7 very healthy children, and hopefully it stays that way. Yeah. And let them believe what they want to believe. I mean, it's society. That's what they're going to do.
It is. You won't be able to change anyone's mind either way.
Right.
Now I know that the Ohio AAP unfortunately has asked him to come on and kind of be on their panel speakers coming up. I don't know when it is. Do you know if he agreed to do that?
He did, and it's in September. Again, this is all, everything is so new to me. This has all happened in like a week's time. It's just, been mind-boggling. So I am honestly not even sure what that even is. And I had some guy that sent me a Facebook message that said, you think him getting vaccinated is bad. You have no idea what he's about to get himself into. I don't even know what this is. I just heard about him accepting to be on this panel of I don't even know what it is. So this is all new to me too. Like I said, this is all happening so fast that my head can't even wrap around everything that's going on right now. Right. So I did hear that he was going to be on some panel in September that was some pediatric.
Yeah.
I don't know, something.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Having a lot of experience with the AAP and how they affect legislation here in Ohio, I have no doubt they will unfortunately be using Ethan. They will be exploiting Ethan to further an agenda, probably for the HPV vaccine, as well as vaccines in general, unfortunately. Now, I know when I spoke to him, and this is a real issue, and as a mom, this might be something you guys have to sit down and talk about, and that is he's 18 now. He's of voting age. And he really adamant about not wanting to make a political statement about this. And he's a smart kid, I can tell. He's a very intelligent kid. He's a great debater. He really is. But he's got to look at the fact and the reality of that is he's 18 years old. He is in a position where he is being used in a political way. He is going to have to come to a stance on that. But that last thing about the political thing, I think that's going to be a very serious issue, and it's going to continue to amplify as it goes on. So I really hope he'll look at that, and that you can help him through that process as well. I don't know if there's anything else that you can think of that maybe you would like to say or leave with our viewers. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got lots of stuff going on.
Yes, no, it's okay. I think one thing that I do feel confident about is that as much as Ethan right now believes that, this is the way to go, pro-vaccine, I also think that through the raising of him, he has also seen so many things in our lives that I have taken a stance for, and that has really changed so many things within our family, just, natural remedies, things that the doctors have said, this, you have to do this in order to be healed. And I have stepped back and said, no, there's got to be another answer. And he has seen that. He's witnessed that throughout the 18 years of his life. So I can't imagine him standing up there saying, we are going to take the rights away from parents to make the best decision on a medical stance, to take that away. I think that he might believe that he has the right to make that decision, but I don't think that he would stand for that to be taken away from even me. I would hope that he would stand up for me to say, no, I have seen too much in the 18 years that has really changed my siblings, my mom's lives that would not have been that way if they pursued only that medical avenue. So I'm hoping that really sways him and weighs heavy on his heart to say, this isn't the only answer. It might be your answer. It might be your answer. It's not the only answer. So
I think
I'm hoping
you demonstrating that you support him to make his own decisions as an adult. I think he needs to also to let people know, including the media. And if he doesn't start doing it soon, it might be too late. Now is the time for Ethan to stand up for his mom and say, look, my mom's standing up for me to make my choices. I will stand for the moms of America that have decided they cannot vaccinate or they choose not to vaccinate for their own good reasons. And I hope that he'll stand up and do that. And maybe you can come alongside him and help him with that as he goes through these next bigger interviews. And I really appreciate you coming on. And again, Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom, we support every parent's right to make medical decisions for their children. And we respect the right of adults to make their own medical decisions as well for vaccination and any medical procedure. So I thank you so much, Jill, for your time. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.